Tell me, what does someone like you contribute to this room?
He doesn't. That's always been the problem.
Who signed the Bay Haven approval? Someone so far above your level you wouldn't recognize the name.
Know your place.
Take that as your cue to get lost.
Know your place. My wife said it out loud in front of 100 people right before she helped dump a bucket of dirty mop water over my head. What she didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that the $860 million terminal deal they were celebrating couldn't close without my signature. She told the controlling shareholder of Rourke Meridian Group to know his place. I did. It was at the head of the table, and they had exactly 72 hours left to figure that out. If this kind of story is your thing, subscribe. A new one goes up every week. The message from Tessa arrived at 6:47 that Friday evening, just as I was getting out of the car in front of the Mariner Grand. 3 words. Everything is ready. I read it, put the phone in my jacket pocket, and walked toward the entrance. The message told me the room upstairs was prepared, the documentation was in place, and the landing pad on the roof had been cleared and confirmed with the pilot. Anyone watching me cross the lobby would have seen a man in a plain dark suit moving without urgency through a hotel he apparently had no particular stake in. That was more or less the impression I had been cultivating for the past 3 years, and it had served its purpose. I should explain what Rourke Meridian Group actually was, because the explanation matters for everything that follows. 8 years earlier, when I married Serena, I was running a mid-sized logistics company, the kind of operation that moves freight between ports and warehouses and never makes the news unless something goes wrong. I sold the majority of that company 4 years into the marriage, and what I did with the proceeds was not, strictly speaking, complicated. I found businesses worth owning that nobody was paying close attention to. Port infrastructure, freight networks, commercial real estate adjacent to shipping lanes, private aviation. I acquired them methodically through a layered structure of holding companies that kept my name off the visible surface of any single transaction. By the time of the Mariner Grand Gala, Rourke Meridian Group controlled assets across multiple sectors, and the $860 million Bay Haven terminal project that Halcyon Ridge Development was celebrating that evening was not, from where I sat, a particularly large number. There were 2 reasons I had not told Serena the full picture. The first was operational. Rourke Meridian was executing a series of interconnected transactions that required anonymity. When the controlling party in a deal becomes publicly known during the negotiation phase, counterparties adjust their positions, pricing shifts, and competing interests emerge. The transactions I was managing depended on the other side not knowing who they were ultimately dealing with until the moment when that information was no longer useful leverage. Disclosing my identity prematurely would have cost real money and real time across multiple deals simultaneously. That was the legitimate reason, and it was sufficient on its own. The second reason was less defensible. I had watched Serena change over the previous 2 years, and I had been afraid of what the truth would do to what remained of our marriage. Not afraid in the way you are afraid of a confrontation, afraid in the quieter way of someone who suspects the answer to a question and keeps finding reasons not to ask it. If Serena knew the full scope of Rourke Meridian, I would never know whether her choices had anything to do with me or only with what I represented. I had let that fear sit in the marriage like a crack in a foundation wall, and I had kept telling myself I would address it when the time was right. I was not proud of that, and I mention it because the story is easier to understand if I don't pretend I had it all figured out from the beginning. The gala at the Mariner Grand was Halcyon Ridge's formal announcement that they had effectively secured the Bay Haven Terminal redevelopment contract. More than 100 guests had been assembled: bankers, investors, construction partners, city officials, Halcyon Ridge leadership, to celebrate what Serena's company was presenting as a near-certain outcome. Serena was the vice president of project development, and this was, by every measure she had shared with me, the largest thing she had ever worked on. I understood that. I had never wanted to take it from her. I had not been included in the original invitation. The invitation I received came directly from Roland Keene, who chaired the investment fund providing the primary capital for the Bay Haven project. Roland had contacted me through a channel that had nothing to do with Halcyon Ridge, and his message had been brief. He wanted me present that evening. Serena did not know Roland had reached out to me, and she would not have understood why he had. That was the piece she was missing. Blake Corbin was already working the room when I walked in. I had met Blake perhaps 8 or 9 times over the preceding 2 years, always in contexts adjacent to Serena's professional life. He was the kind of man who understood instinctively how to perform confidence. The right car, the right suit, the practiced ease of someone who had decided that appearing successful was essentially the same as being successful. He made remarks about my appearance within the first 4 minutes. Something about whether I was attending a different kind of event afterward. A few people laughed. I said nothing because there was nothing worth saying and because I was watching the document he was holding loosely in his left hand. The document was facing away from me, but I could see the bottom corner of the last page clearly enough, the signature block, and in it, something that made everything else in the room go temporarily quiet in my head. A signature formatted to represent an authorized representative of Rourke Meridian Group. I had not signed any document connected to Bay Haven. I had not authorized anyone to sign on my behalf. Whatever that signature was, it had not come from me. I kept that observation to myself and focused on what Blake was saying to the cluster of investors around him. He was telling them with the confidence of someone relaying established fact that Rourke Meridian had provided its final conditional approval for the Bay Haven project. He said it the way he said most things, as though the act of saying it was sufficient to make it true. He had said something earlier in the evening that I had filed without knowing why, that people who know how to position themselves correctly will always outperform people who simply work hard. It had sounded like a general philosophy. By the time the evening was over, I understood it was a description of something specific. I asked calmly and directly who had signed the approval document. Blake laughed and said the name was someone well beyond my level of engagement. A few people smiled. Serena appeared at my elbow within seconds and walked me a few steps away from the group. Her voice was quiet in the way it gets when she is controlling something she does not want to become visible. She told me this was the most important night of her career and that she needed me not to interfere. I told her that if someone had presented unauthorized documentation to investors as confirmation of a deal that had not been properly approved, she needed to know that before the evening went further. She heard it as jealousy. What happened next was not something I could have predicted, even knowing how far things had deteriorated between us. Blake returned to where we were standing, and he began again with the commentary about where I fit in a room like this one. A hotel employee had left a cleaning cart near the edge of the gathering space, and on it was a mop bucket. Blake noticed it and picked it up. Serena had a moment. I saw it. There was a fraction of a second where she looked at me, really looked not with contempt, but with something older than contempt, something that had been there before Blake, and before the past 2 years, and I thought she was going to step in front of what was about to happen. She reached out and took hold of the other side of the bucket instead. She looked at me and said, "Know your place." Then they tipped it. The water was cold and it smelled like industrial cleaning solution and floor dirt. Several people nearby made sounds. A few held up phones. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, looked at the hotel manager who had appeared at the edge of the scene and asked him quietly whether the landing pad on the roof was clear. He said it was. Serena laughed when she heard the question. Blake said something I didn't catch. I walked toward the elevator, leaving a trail of wet footprints on the marble behind me. Tessa was already waiting 1 floor up with the folder I had asked her to prepare in the room that had been reserved under a name that meant nothing to anyone at the Halcyon Ridge Gala. She was standing at the table when I came in, and she handed me a towel from the bathroom without comment before opening the folder. The small, practical competence of someone who had been doing difficult work alongside someone else long enough that certain things didn't require words. The investigation that mattered was not happening in the ballroom. It was happening upstairs, and it had been running for 20 minutes before Blake Corbin decided to pick up a mop bucket. Tessa had the folder organized before I finished changing into the dry clothes she had brought. She had pulled the relevant documentation from the Rourke Meridian files, cross-referenced it against what Halcyon Ridge had sent to the investor group, and laid out the discrepancies in the order that would be most useful to a lawyer reviewing them for the first time. I sat down, read through what she had assembled, and understood within about 12 minutes why Blake had been so confident in that ballroom. The conditional approval letter was the center of it. 4 pages on what appeared to be Rourke Meridian letterhead, stating in carefully constructed language that Rourke Meridian had agreed in principle to the Bayhaven project, had granted conditional access to its logistics infrastructure, and had authorized Halcyon Ridge to present these positions to financing partners as established. The document was dated 11 weeks earlier. It carried a signature formatted correctly for a Rourke Meridian authorization, right title, right position, right block, and at first glance it looked exactly like what it claimed to be. The problem was the underlying source. The signature had been lifted from a routine logistics consultation agreement I had signed 17 months earlier in connection with a completely unrelated port assessment project. Someone had extracted that signature and applied it to the approval letter. The metadata on the fabricated document showed it had been created on a machine registered to a Halcyon Ridge network address, and that the creation date predated the signature date by 11 days, meaning the document had been built before it was supposedly executed, and the timestamps had been manually adjusted afterward. I asked Tessa to identify who had handled the original consulting agreement on the Halcyon Ridge side. The point of contact throughout that earlier engagement had been Blake Corbin. He had received copies of the signed documents, which meant he had had access to exactly what was needed to construct what Tessa was looking at. The philosophy he had shared with the investors downstairs was not abstract wisdom. It was a description of a plan he had been executing for over a year. The deeper layer took longer, but when it came through, it reframed everything. The Halcyon Ridge submission package contained a reference to an entity called Crescent Harbor Advisory, identified as a strategic consultant. The entity had been registered 8 months earlier. If the project closed successfully, Crescent Harbor was positioned to receive a consulting fee, an equity stake, and development rights over 2 secondary parcels adjacent to the terminal, a potential value exceeding $48 million. Blake Corbin's name did not appear on the registration documents, but Tessa traced the registered agent to a law firm connected to Blake through 2 intermediary holding companies. He had not been trying to help Halcyon Ridge close a deal. He had been using Halcyon Ridge's deal and a fraudulent document carrying Rourke Meridian's authorization to position himself for $48 million. Around this same time, a contact at one of Blake's intermediary entities flagged to a Halcyon Ridge administrator that questions were being raised about the Rourke Meridian documentation, enough for Blake to understand that someone was examining the authorization chain more carefully than he had anticipated. He moved quickly. He obtained a recording of the Friday evening incident from a guest who had been filming, and he edited it to begin after Serena's statements, and the moment with the bucket keeping only the portion that showed me standing and moving toward the group, without the preceding context. He sent the edited clip to Halcyon Ridge board members with a characterization of me as a jealous husband who had crashed his wife's event and was now interfering with the Bayhaven process as personal retaliation. I needed to speak to Serena before deciding what to do next. Not because I owed her a warning, but because I still did not know whether she had understood what Blake had done, or whether she had been willing. I found her in the corridor near the event space about 40 minutes after leaving the ballroom. I asked whether she knew what Blake had done with the Rourke Meridian signature. I said it plainly to see her reaction before giving her the full picture. The confusion was genuine, the kind that doesn't get performed for someone you're managing. But then I asked whether she had signed a certification confirming she had personally verified Rourke Meridian's consent. The way she went very still after that question told me what I needed to know. She had signed it. She had attested to an approval that had not been properly given, which meant her name was attached to a material misrepresentation in a financing submission to institutional investors. I told her the document trail would be examined once the financing closed, and that when it was, she would be the person whose signature was on the certification. She said she had been given information by Blake that she had understood to be accurate. Then she said the divorce papers had been with her attorney for 2 weeks. That was how she chose to close the conversation. Not by addressing what I had told her, not by asking what could still be corrected, but by telling me the marriage was already handled as far as she was concerned. I stood in that corridor and understood that she had decided to stay on Blake's side regardless of what I had presented, because whatever he had built around her over the past year had become more real to her than the evidence I was describing. When a colleague contacted her to confirm Blake's account of the Friday incident, she confirmed it. She did not add to it. She also did not correct it. That was when I took off my wedding ring. I did it alone, sitting at the desk in the hotel room, and I set it on the table beside Tessa's folder. The marriage had been ending for a long time. What Serena had chosen in that moment to let a lie about me stand, because correcting it would have cost her something, was not the cause of the ending. It was the confirmation of something that had already concluded. I stopped trying to find a way to save it. A Rourke Meridian board member called that evening with concerns about the circulating story and asked me to avoid public statements until the situation could be assessed. I told him I understood, and I told him to have the full legal team available for a Monday morning meeting at the Mariner Grand, because the governance questions he was worried about were considerably more serious than a personal dispute, and the documentation to prove it was already prepared. The Rourke Meridian helicopter touched down on the Mariner Grand roof at 8:52 Monday morning, 7 minutes before the Halcyon Ridge closing session was scheduled to begin. I had timed it deliberately, not so early that Blake could restructure his position, and not so late that it would appear I was making an entrance for effect. I wanted to walk into that room while people were still settling, while the coffee was still being poured, while Blake's version of events was still the only version anyone had been given. Tessa came with me carrying the documentation folder. 2 members of the Rourke Meridian legal team followed. Roland Keene met us at the elevator, standing in the corridor outside the conference room with the composure of a man who had been doing this kind of work for 30 years and had seen most of the ways a deal could go wrong. The room held perhaps 30 people: Halcyon Ridge executives, primary lenders, 3 institutional investors, city representatives, and the lawyers. Each party had brought to manage what was supposed to be a formality. Blake was at the far end of the table, standing rather than seated, talking to one of the bank representatives with the ease of someone who believes the morning is already going his way. Serena was positioned near the side wall behind the main table, still present in her official capacity. Not yet formally removed from the project, though that determination would follow from whatever happened in the next hour. Blake saw me when I came through the door. His expression processed something the way expressions do when information arriving doesn't match the model the brain has been running. He said in a voice pitched to carry that he wasn't aware the meeting was open to outside parties. He said it pleasantly, in the tone of someone identifying a clerical error that was about to be corrected. I walked to the head of the table and set down the folder. Blake said, still pleasantly, "What exactly did I think I was doing?" I told him I was taking my seat. He said the seat at the head of the table was for the lead counsel for the primary lender. I looked at him and recalled what he had said on Friday evening, that the person who had signed the approval document was someone so far above my level that I wouldn't recognize the name. I pulled my chair out and sat down. I told the room 2 nights ago I was told to know my place. I said I did know my place. It was at the head of this table. Roland Keene stepped forward and introduced me by name and title: controlling shareholder of Rourke Meridian Group, with 61% ownership interest in the entity whose authorization was the foundational condition for the Bay Haven terminal financing. He said it without theater, in the same tone he would use to introduce anyone in a professional context, and the information landed in the room the way information lands when it reorganizes everything around it. Blake said that wasn't possible. Roland said it was, and opened his own folder. I told the room to open the documentation package in front of them. The legal team walked through the evidence in the sequence we had organized over the weekend. The conditional approval letter came first, presented beside the original consulting agreement from 17 months earlier, with the specific elements of transfer, identified the signature block, the formatting, the document identifier code that had been partially reproduced. Then the metadata analysis showing the file had been created on a Halcyon Ridge network endpoint, and that the creation date predated the signature date by 11 days. The lead lender's counsel leaned forward at that point and wrote something on his legal pad without looking up. The Crescent Harbor Advisory connection came next. The legal team traced the entity registration, identified the registered agent, mapped the chain of intermediary companies, connecting that agent to Blake's personal holding structure, and presented the financial terms of the arrangement, the consulting fee, the equity position, the development rights to the secondary parcels, and the potential combined value of $48 million. Blake's name did not appear on the registration documents. The connections were there for anyone willing to look, and the legal team had looked. I watched Blake's face through that portion of the presentation. The confidence he had carried into the room had not left all at once. It had been draining incrementally with each piece of documentation, the way certainty drains when the architecture it was built on starts coming apart in sequence. By the time the Crescent Harbor documents were on the table, he had gone quiet in a way that was different from the quiet of someone who is gathering himself to respond. He pulled his jacket lapel once, straightened it, and looked at the table in front of him. He tried one more approach. He turned toward Serena and said in a voice that had found a new and lower register that she had provided the information he had used to prepare the approval documentation, that she was the one who had confirmed the Rourke Meridian position, and that his reliance on her representations had been reasonable. He was in the plainest possible terms pointing at her in front of 30 people and asking her to absorb the damage on his behalf. Serena looked at Blake for a long moment. She looked at him the way you look at something when you are in the process of revising your understanding of what it actually was. She did not defend him. She said she had signed a certification based on information she had been given, that she had understood it to be accurate, and that she had not independently verified the Rourke Meridian documentation before attesting to it. It was careful and limited and honest, and it protected Blake from nothing. The last piece of evidence was the security footage from the Mariner Grand. The hotel's system had covered the entire event space, and the complete footage showed the full sequence Blake's remarks over the preceding 40 minutes. Serena's escalating statements. The moment she reached for the bucket, and then my response, wiping my face, asking about the landing pad, walking to the elevator without raising my voice or moving toward either of them. The version Blake had distributed was not an excerpt. It was a fabrication of context, the same way the approval letter had been a fabrication of authorization. Both rested on the same technique: take something real and remove the parts that tell you what it actually means. When the footage finished, Blake pushed his chair back from the table with both hands and looked at the middle distance for a moment, not at the screen, not at Serena, not at anyone in the room. Then he gathered the documents he had brought, stood up, and walked to the door. He paused once with his hand on the frame facing away from the room and then continued through. No one called after him. Roland Keene announced the suspension of the financing process pending a full independent review. All conditional approvals were formally withdrawn by Rourke Meridian. The Bay Haven Terminal project would proceed to a new competitive process under clean conditions. The CEO of Halcyon Ridge, who had been in the room throughout, made the decision to suspend Blake from his position, effective immediately, and to remove Serena from the project pending the outcome of the review, a determination he conveyed to her directly in a brief exchange near the sidewall as the larger group began to disperse. The divorce was finalized over the following weeks without significant dispute. I did not use the Bay Haven documentation as leverage in the settlement, because the settlement was not what that documentation was for. I took what was mine and left what had been shared, and the lawyers managed the rest. Some weeks after that, I was at a private airfield outside Savannah when Serena found me. She had come without an appointment, and without Blake, and without the professional framing that had surrounded every interaction in the last 2 years of our marriage. She was standing near the hangar in the morning light, still the way people are still when they have come a long distance to say something and are now uncertain how to begin. She asked why I had never told her. I said that the operational reasons had been real, and that the personal reason had been fear, and that both were true at the same time, and that I owned the second one entirely. She said that if she had known, and I stopped her there. I told her that was precisely the problem. If she needed to know what I had before she could decide whether to respect me, then we had ended a long time before that Friday evening at the Mariner Grand, and the bucket of water had just been the moment she showed me clearly what had already been decided. She stood with that for a moment. Then she turned and walked back toward her car, unhurried, without looking back, the walk of someone who has finished something they came to finish. I watched her go. Then Tessa appeared at the hangar door and asked whether we were heading to Bayhaven. I told her no, the terminal would go to open tender. Rourke Meridian might compete for it or might not, depending on what the numbers looked like after a clean assessment. She said I could have given the project to ourselves. I said that having the ability to do something and having a reason to do it were not the same thing. I walked toward the helicopter. The rotors began to turn. What stays with me from all of this isn't the helicopter or the documentation or the moment Roland introduced me at the head of the table. It's something simpler than that. It's the fraction of a second in the ballroom when Serena looked at me, really looked before she reached for the bucket. That moment before the choice when she still could have done something different. Most of us have been in a version of that room, where someone decided they already knew what we were worth and treated us accordingly and never thought to check whether they were right. The interesting thing about that kind of assumption is how much it reveals about the person making it. If stories like this one land somewhere for you, subscribe to the channel. A new one goes up every week, and this is exactly the kind of thing we cover. And if someone in your life needs to hear this today, send it to them. Sometimes the right story finds people at exactly the right moment.